I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
In this episode, I will be following along with the beginning of the American Revolution. This will be one part of my explanation on the American Revolution, and if you're looking for a military history account of the American War of Independence, or the Revolutionary War, I suggest listening to the next episode as well. This will be a fairly familiar narrative for most Americans, for obvious reasons, but much of the myth and legend around this time period clouds the historical perspective. I will give you viewpoints that are unfamiliar to the average person, and I will ask questions that are rarely asked. Hopefully, together we can find some of the answers along the way. In the history that I will provide, the main characters will not drive the narrative, and I begrudgingly must acknowledge that I'm not perfect when it comes to bias. But I will do my best to steer clear of such tendencies. That being said, some of the text I draw from will be inclined to a certain side of the conflict, but I will be drawing from a mixed bag from both American and British accounts. Where to begin with such an extravagant revolutionary turn of events? Start with the Declaration of Independence, perhaps Lexington and Concord, or maybe with the all-too-famous line from James Otis, "Taxation without representation is tyranny." No, none of these. In fact, I shall begin with the 7 Years' War. I'll cut to the chase, though. The 7 Years' War was a world war fought between the British Empire and France. The war was from 1754 to 1763, which I know is 9 years, but everything about the 7 Years' War is confusing. And it raged from Europe to India to the Americas. In the North American theater it was known as the French and Indian War, but the global war between the imperial powers involved Prussia, confederations of Native Americans, Austria, the Russian Empire, Spain, the Swedish Empire, and even the ancient Indian Mughal Empire. The conflict is known by half a dozen different names that I need not convey, but what is important to take away from this 18th century world war is who ended up with what, particularly in North America. Thanks to the sound leadership of the English Prime Minister William Pitt, during the crucial stages of the war, Britain gained an upper hand and it was all but over in the American and Asian theaters of the war by the end of 1761. Yet not all was well, because King George II of Great Britain and Ireland passed away, and the English political machine that had changed so much since the last time we talked about it was about to be shook up yet again as his son George III took the throne. I had not intended to delve deeply into British politics, but I see now that an understanding of Parliament and the overall state of Great Britain is as necessary as understanding the American colonies. So let's take a dip into 1760s Britain then. Throughout both King George I and II's reigns, Parliament and the ministry had rarely been meddled with. In fact, they had held most of the power in Britain. More particularly, the Whig party in Parliament had held an almost indefatigable grip on the levers of power in the empire. The reasons for this are beyond complicated and not relevant to the impending revolution. The Whigs' dominance did not mean they had complete control of Parliament, however, and it also did not mean that those individuals that gained high office would keep it. Rather, the business of administration and government was cutthroat as usual. Yet when George III took the crown, he took a keen interest in Parliament and his administrations. The Whig dominance was broken quite quickly, and the administration of the great William Pitt was beginning to crumble. King George placed his own people around Pitt, and this quickly led to fracturing over how to handle the final stages of the 7 Years' War. After a pivotal altercation, Pitt saw the writing on the wall, and in 1762 resigned from office. The ambitious king then replaced him with George Grenville. Despite the absence of Pitt and the falterings of the new administration, the World War was brought to a close in Britain's favor by the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The treaty was very favorable to the British, with Great Britain acquiring all of New France and Spanish Florida. The part of the treaty relevant to us is that it gave control of almost everything east of the Mississippi River to Britain, so it would have seemed that Britain hit the jackpot, but this is not so. Before I move along to 1763, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit for context. Many Britons in the mid and late 1780s wrote satire pieces joking about how King George and Parliament had killed their golden goose in the Americas. But why? Why in the world would the British leaders let this golden ticket across the Atlantic slip through their fingers? Well, why is the wrong question, because it wasn't at all intentional. That brings us to the question of how. Well, the answer goes back to 1763 and the lands acquired across North America. Sometimes people in country get dealt poor hands and have to find the silver lining with the situation in order to move on. But Britain was essentially dealt the photo negative of that. Sort of like winning the lottery often ruins people's lives. Well, that's what the British Empire had, the hard-earned winning lottery ticket in their North American lands. What could possibly be wrong with the assets they had gained? They had amazing potential, this is true. But, to use a financial term, the colonies obtained were toxic assets. The lands and colonies also came with a crapload of baggage to deal with as a government. Basically, if the colonies were a gift-wrapped package, I assume the box had a handle with care sticker right on top. Yet also in the package was another gift, this one also unwelcome. Massive war debt. Indeed, Parliament almost doubled their national debt thanks to the 7 Years' War. Around 1754, their debt was somewhere between 70 to 80 million pounds, but by the war's end it was near 130 million pounds. Moving along now, Prime Minister Grenville made raising a revenue in order to reduce the debt a top priority of his administration. This makes sense, but how he and the parliamentary leaders would go about it does not. They began to seek avenues of gaining further revenue, and as they did so, King George also made waves by decreeing his Royal Proclamation of 1763. What this proclamation did was set the Appalachian Mountains as the settlement boundary. The reason for this was to prevent wars with natives in the lands past the Appalachian Mountains, and also because Britain wanted to maintain administration and order over their settlements. The U.S. government would have a similar problem in the 1780s and 90s over the same issues, but as you might imagine, this did not sit well with many colonists, especially those that had the money to buy up, or simply take, large tracts of land. This irritated many wealthy colonists, but not too much because, quite frankly, the proclamation was ignored by the Americans. Of course, King George had no inkling of this, so he and Grenville continued on. I'll have former British Prime Minister Churchill explain what came next. Quote, George III was also determined that the colonies should pay their share in the expenses of the empire and in garrisoning the New World. For this there were strong arguments. England had supplied most of the men and money in the struggle with France for their protection, and indeed their survival. But the methods used by the British government were ineffective and imprudent. End quote. Now I will do my best to mix British and American sources in order to not lose sight of the truth. And a perfect example of that is Churchill, because what Churchill said is the truth, but not entirely the whole truth. For it is entirely correct that England did foot the bill for the war, and many of the soldiers were in fact English. The problem is, Englanders lacked perspective. They could not, or did not, consider that Americans had an entirely different view. The Americans had mixed emotions because while they were happy to be rid of violent and unfriendly neighbors, they were quite irritated at being involved in Britain's worldwide schemes against the other powers of Europe. They were entirely loyal to Crown and Parliament, but they no longer felt English. Frankly, the colonists were sick of European affairs and feared that the Empire's machinations would only draw them again and again into Europe's continual war machine. Nevertheless, war debt needed to be reduced in some manner. To rectify the situation, Parliament then modified the 1733 Molasses Act to include extra taxation and restrictions on multiple products. This is now known as the Sugar Act. It was not a new tax on the colonies, a direct tax, or even a particularly high tax, but what the modified Molasses Act did was place a strengthened tax on certain sugar-related goods sold to French and Spanish West Indies. This began to cause rumblings among merchants in both England and the colonies, especially since the new tax raised very little revenue. So why did Parliament do it? If it was raising very little revenue and annoying merchants on both sides of the Atlantic, why do it at all? Well, that requires an economic explanation. For a little while longer, actually, I fear this will sound an awful lot like an economic podcast. But for good reason. After all, economics and history are very intertwined. What Parliament and Grenville's government was trying to do was use mercantilism to maintain Great Britain, and more specifically, England's place in the world. Mercantilism is an economic theory that, well, I'll give you Encyclopedia Britannica's explanation. Quote, mercantilism is an economic theory and practice common in Europe from the 16th to 18th century that promoted government regulation of a nation's economy for the purpose of augmenting state power at the expense of rival national powers. End quote. As you can imagine, after getting the explanation from our handy encyclopedia, such an economic system would have appealed to Great Britain at this time, because what the Sugar Act did was increase Britain's dominance over the world's sugar market while protecting English corporations. Such tactics often work, but they are not always wise. Moving forward in time now, George Grenville knew his administration's Sugar Act was not making a dent in their massive deficit. The Sugar Act had been an indirect tax, meaning the tax is applied by intermediaries throughout the economy, so the king and parliament sought to gain a true source of revenue through a direct tax on the colonies. This was the 1765 Stamp Act. The thing that is commonly forgotten about the Stamp Act is that this was only a new tax for the colonists. Since 1694, England itself had tax stamps on all legal documents, and now Parliament was seeking to extend that tax to America. Still, Parliament did not take to the idea immediately. They requested a commission to propose the idea to the leaders of the American colonies. The only colonies that disagreed or protested were the New England colonies and Virginia. But even so, Grenville and his leaders received assurances that the proposed Stamp Act could be enforced. The problem with such assurances was that the governors of the colonies were seen as British overseers, so they didn't really know how their constituents felt about such a proposal. Nevertheless, the bill went to the House of Commons for debate. Grenville and Charles Townsend, who will become infamous later for his Townsend Acts, were the main sponsors for the Stamp Act. But many members spoke out against the taxation on America, specifically Colonel Isaac Barré, Rose Fuller, and Sir William Meredith. I'm jumping into the debate in the Houses of Parliament because I want to expand our perspective and remind you how divided England and even Parliament was over the developing crisis in America. Many of the elected members of Parliament valiantly defend American interstead, and the records I present are from February 1765. Prime Minister Grenville began the proceedings, quote, "The reason of the delaying the proposal to this year was to gain all possible information and to give Americans an opportunity of conveying information to this House. The objection of the colonies is from a general right of mankind not to be taxed but by their representatives. The Parliament of Great Britain virtually represents the whole kingdom, not actually great trading towns. Not a 20th part of the people are actually represented. If Americans are not subject to this burden of tax, they are not entitled to the privilege of Englishmen." End quote. So Grenville and Parliament at this point have heard the no taxation without representation argument, and Grenville simply points out that no one, not even the English, are truly represented in legislation. To add to this, William Beckford concurred, stating, quote, "As to representation, all England is not represented, but it is a written part of our Constitution that it is so." End quote. Colonel Isaac then rose in disagreement, saying, quote, "We are working in the dark. The less we do, the better. Caution should be exercised lest the power be abused and 2 million unrepresented people mistreated. We know not the real effects of this." End quote. Sir Meredith also disagreed, saying, "The safety of this country consists in this, with the respect that we cannot lay a tax upon others without taxing ourselves. This is not the case in America." End quote. The arguments continued for another month until it was put to a vote and passed by a margin of 250 to 50 in favor on March 22, 1765. Before moving directly to America's reaction to the Stamp Act, there is one more act of Parliament that was passed in 1765, only months after the Stamp Act. This was the Quartering Act, which required colonials to find and or pay lodging expenses for British soldiers garrisoned in the colonies. There really is no valid defense of the Quartering Act in my opinion, and it infuriated the colonies to no end. But the colonies did their best to circumvent the Quartering Act for the next several years. How did America react to the infamous Stamp Act, though? With a purpose, I would say. Highly organized and rapid attacks on the new tax would soon come, but the fight began in Virginia's House of Burgesses. The House of Burgesses was the first legislative assembly founded in the colonies and was entirely elected by white male property-owning residents of the Virginia colony, a unique thing during this time. In May of 1765, the upstart Virginia lawyer and politician Patrick Henry spurred the House of Burgesses into a frenzy where they passed 5 separate resolves outlining that Great Britain had no authority over Virginia and that if Crown and Parliament continued, they warned of further civil unrest. The House of Burgesses, in all honesty, had no authority or jurisdiction for their claims, but the people were beginning to agree, and that is what mattered most. Virginia's bold steps inspired the other colonies to follow suit. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, South Carolina, and many port cities issued similar resolutions to Virginia. New York City's City Council even unanimously agreed to a non-importation agreement that would bar any merchants buying or selling with Great Britain until the Stamp Act was repealed. There was no revolutionary tone in the language of the colonies or the colonists at this time, but rather an overwhelming consensus seeking the repeal of the Stamp Act. The colonial boycott was underway in the summer of 1765. Certain citizens, mainly printers and merchants, sought to go even further, though, in the northern colonies. They wanted to enforce boycotting the Stamp Act. One of these organizations has gained fame, the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. Led by Samuel Adams from Boston, the Sons of Liberty punished merchants that did not boycott British products and often published the time and dates of their demonstrations in the Boston Gazette. Most of the operations engineered by the Sons of Liberty were simply demonstrations, but some of their later and more illicit actions made them a borderline terrorist organization. Amidst the Stamp Act crisis, Massachusetts proposed that members from each colony gather to discuss how to properly combat the actions of Parliament. Many agreed, and New York City was chosen as the site for the so-called Stamp Act Congress. Delegates from 9 of the 13 colonies arrived, and on October 19, 1765, they drew up a petition to Parliament and King George entitled The Declaration of Rights and Grievances. As you can tell from the title, it listed the grievances committed upon the colonies by the recent acts of Parliament. But perhaps unwisely, Parliament refused to even consider the petition. The colonies then determined to hit Great Britain in the pocketbook. But they also determined to overwhelm them with the press. Writers from almost all of the 13 colonies began to publish their opinions on the state of Great Britain. Many authors used pen names in order to preserve their anonymity. Some of the writers were John Dickinson from Philadelphia, who distributed a pamphlet picked up by several major newspapers throughout the colonies. Others were Maurice Moore in North Carolina, Daniel Delaney in Maryland, Benjamin Church in Connecticut, and Richard Bland in Virginia. However, not all of the colonies were against the Stamp Act. There were loyalists, most especially in the Deep South, that argued it even printed works in support of Parliament. The public protest finally began to have an influence as the year 1766 began. But not necessarily because of the boycotts or violent protests in America, but mainly due to the public opinion in Britain. In The Age of Revolution by Churchill, he explained, quote, "The most effective opposition came from English merchants, who realized that the act imperiled the recovery of their commercial debt and denounced it as contrary to the true commercial interests of the empire." End quote. In other words, English creditors began to lobby and petition Crown and Parliament to repeal the tax because if they didn't, the American farmers and merchants who were in debt to them would not be able to pay their debts. Fearing a massive loss on their investment in the colonies, the English merchants lobbied around the clock to change Parliament's mind, and change it did. King George was greatly disturbed, if not downright angry, at the rebellious tendencies and language throughout the crisis, and sought to convene a new government that could rectify the situation. So George Grenville and his cabinet lost their jobs and were replaced by the moderate Rockingham administration. In the Rockingham group was a young Irish politician named Edmund Burke, who would go down as one of the greatest orators in history, and a supporter of the American cause during his future run in Parliament. The Rockingham government would only last for 13 months, but they steered Great Britain out of a crisis for a little while longer. In 1766, they repealed the Stamp Act and got the House of Commons to agree that it was illegal to seize private papers and issue general warrants. They also passed a declaratory act that reaffirmed Parliament's right to tax its subjects, which appeased the English, but it was bound to cause problems again. Despite the deft maneuvering of the Rockingham administration, King George replaced them in 1767 with a government led by an old and ailing William Pitt. By this time, Pitt was a shadow of his former self, and his health was so poor he rarely spoke. Instead, the affairs of the new government fell into other hands. They were conducted by King George's chosen ministry men, Charles Townsend and Lord Shelburne. This new government would prove to be the harshest the American colonists had yet to see, and it was spearheaded by Charles Townsend. 1767 was a year that truly put fuel to fire, as 5 parliamentary acts were passed targeted directly at the American colonies and proposed by Charles Townsend. If the colonists had thought the Stamp Act had violated their rights, the Townsend Acts were a direct attack on their rights. The first act passed was the Revenue Act, which set import taxes on British goods, specifically paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea. That wasn't all, though. The revenues gained by the tax would be used to pay the salaries of royal officials and the maintenance costs of garrisoning British troops. Furthermore, the Revenue Act approved the use of search warrants by customs officials without approval by a court. Before I point out why that would incense the colonists, let me break down the other 4 Townsend Acts. The next was the Indemnity Act, which removed taxes on British East India Company tea. Then the Commissioners of Customs Act, which gave customs officials the new authority to search merchant stores, ships, and warehouses without court approval. Then came the New York Restraining Act, which suspended and outlawed the New York Colonial Assembly if they continued to boycott the Quartering Act. A little while later, in early 1768, the final Townsend Act was passed, the Vice Admiralty Court Act. What this act did was create a new court in America that would only prosecute smugglers. But the real kicker was that they would be prosecuted without a trial by jury. This is where, as historical readers, we begin to understand why the colonists began to feel as if they were ruled by a bunch of out-of-touch parliamentary overseers from the island of Britain. Now I'm going to really dissect what made these acts so bad, because this was a turning point. So much so that in 1789, David Ramsay wrote in his History of the American Revolution, quote, "Had Great Britain repealed the whole of the acts and forever relinquished all claim to the right or even the exercise of taxation on the colonies, the union of the two countries might have lasted for ages." End quote. Let the dissection begin. What the Townsend Acts did was directly attack American merchants, assemblies, and according to the colonists, their rights as Englishmen. Americans were fully aware that they were being slighted and infringed upon. The acts also cracked down on American smuggling, which Americans felt as a massive slight because the smuggling was the only way the merchants could make a profit thanks to England's massive tax network and the monstrosity that was the East India Company. Continuing on, the acts also gave customs officials the authority to inspect anywhere they saw fit. This was seen as a massive violation of personal, corporate, and privacy rights. They also removed New York's Colonial Assembly for boycotting the Quartering Act, despite the Assembly always being peaceably assembled and properly elected. This in particular was seen as a breach of colonial autonomy. Lastly, the Townsend Acts violated the long-understood English right to have a trial by jury when the Admiralty courts prosecuted smugglers with only a judge. As you can probably see, the American Bill of Rights was very much linked to these parliamentary enactments. Accordingly, the colonists were enraged. But how in the blazes did Parliament pass such legislation in the first place? Besides simply having the votes to pass the acts, Great Britain did not have many written laws stating that a citizen had the right of this and that. It was simply an understood, unwritten tradition. Also, Parliament seemingly had the authority to override any previous laws anyways. So essentially, Parliament did not do anything illegal because there was no written constitution of governance dictating the legality of their legislation. And even if there was, their acts could supersede it. The American colonists did not see it that way, though, and they were enraged by the Townsend Acts. Quickly, Massachusetts and Connecticut agreed to non-importation agreements and began a New England colonial boycott of anything British. New York City soon followed suit in 1768, and even Charleston, South Carolina began a boycott in 1769. New York, Philadelphia, and Boston began to enforce the boycotts yet again, and the Sons of Liberty in Boston were fast becoming not a band of brigands, but a wild crew of heroes and heroines. Many people in the countryside of the colonies were still very loyal to Britain, however, because they were not really affected by the parliamentary actions like those of the port cities. But the boycott leaders knew this, and again fought with pen and press to gather public support for their cause, because if they didn't have that, their cause would surely fail. John Dickinson then wrote the most widely read pamphlet of the time, entitled Letters from a Farmer. Signing every letter simply, "A Farmer," Dickinson's 12 letters were published by the Pennsylvania Chronicle and distributed throughout the colonies in early 1768. The word patriots was also now becoming endeared to the cause after an anonymous woman, later known as Hannah Griffiths, published a poem entitled The Female Patriots in Pennsylvania. Protesting, boycotting, and dissension was widespread, but none truly believed rebellion necessary. The general feeling in the colonies is best summed up by the powerful words of John Dickinson. Quote, "This money is to be taken from us. We are therefore taxed. Those who are taxed without their own consent, expressed by themselves or their representatives, are slaves. We are taxed without our own consent. We are therefore, I speak it with grief, I speak it with indignation, we are slaves. A farmer." End quote. That was from Dickinson's 7th letter, and his language is intentionally hyperbolic in nature, but the reason it was so popular is because it had resonance throughout the colonies. Bloodshed had yet to occur, but violence appeared right around the corner as the summer of 1768 began. In May, the situation reached a fever pitch when British smuggling officers stopped a small merchant vessel called Liberty, owned by the Boston merchant John Hancock. This was done in Boston Harbor, and the Sons of Liberty under Sam Adams responded by re-seizing the Liberty and forcibly removing all customs officials from the Boston area. Britain responded swiftly by sending troops to garrison Boston as a martial police force. This didn't sit well at all, though, and Massachusetts was soon becoming the center of all controversy, and Boston was seen by Parliament and the King as the heart of the colonial tension. Surprisingly, though, the hotbed of tensions would actually be released, because by 1769, only half of British exports going to the American colonies were arriving. So Parliament finally consented and removed all the taxes imposed by the Townsend Acts, except for the duty on tea. This was seen as a massive victory, but New Englanders were not so sure because Parliament still refused to yield their authority to tax the colonies. Yet until 1770, tensions had luckily de-escalated across the colonies and everything seemed back to normal outside of the ongoing tension in the Massachusetts Bay Area. In fact, it seemed full unification was at hand across the colonies, but Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty were determined to cause problems. To accomplish this goal, Adams and his people spread false, evil rumors about the British troops in Boston. Bostonians began to refer to the redcoats as lobsters and other more obscene names, and soon wherever the troops patrolled or marched they were followed, screamed at, and many threw snowballs and even manure at the British troops. Finally, conflict broke out in March of 1770. This was the Boston Massacre. Future President John Adams gives his account, quote, "In the street we were informed that the British soldiers had fired on the inhabitants, killed some and wounded others near the townhouse. Endeavors had been systematically pursued for many months by certain busy characters to excite quarrels, encounters, and combats. I suspected that this was the explosion which had been intentionally wrought up by designing men. If the soldiers in self-defense should kill any of them, they must be tried, and if truth and law prevailed, must be acquitted." End quote. I hope you were listening careful to Adams' account, because it is very interesting that he, as a future founding father, wrote honestly that the crowd in Boston had been trying to, quote, excite quarrels and combats, and that he believed the soldiers should be acquitted. What makes this still more interesting is John Adams was the cousin of the instigator, Samuel Adams. Furthermore, John Adams was a lawyer and he himself defended the British soldiers in court, and had the court acquit them of charges of murder. 2 of the 9 soldiers tried were, however, found guilty of manslaughter. Thus the Boston Massacre was a ruse caused and concocted by colonial radicals, but nevertheless blood was now spilt in America. Shifting our perspective back to England, King George now desired another change of leadership in his government. The man chosen would preside over the loss of the American colonies. Lord North became Prime Minister and First Lord of the Treasury in 1770. Back in America, the so-called massacre in Boston did little to nothing to change the opinion of most colonials. It seemed the colonies were still content in being disunited. Nevertheless, the radicals continued on, keen on sowing more seeds of revolution. They needed but one opportunity to unite the colonies as one rebellious, cohesive unit. But that is for next episode. Remember to come back and join Everything History for Part 2 and the conclusion of the American Revolution in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you, and good night.